Hello, everyone.
I wasn't ready for what I saw. It was just another ordinary afternoon, or at least, that's what I thought. Stepping into the house, I expected the usual silence, but something felt off. Passing by the library door, I noticed it was slightly ajar. I wasn't planning to stop, but curiosity got the better of me. That's when I peeked inside and froze. There he was, Joel, my stepfather, sitting comfortably on the leather chair, completely immersed in a book. Not just any book, it was Kama Sutra. My heart skipped a beat. Joel, the man who always seemed so put together, so proper, was reading something that felt way too personal, way too intimate. I wasn't supposed to see this. Before I could decide whether to leave or stay, he looked up and caught me staring. His eyes locked on mine, and for a second, neither of us moved. It was like time had stopped. He quickly closed the book, setting it aside like he had been caught doing something wrong. "I didn't hear you come in," he said, his voice calm, but there was tension beneath it. I forced a nervous smile, hoping it didn't show how much my heart was racing. "I was just passing by," I mumbled, trying to sound casual, though nothing about this moment felt casual. His eyes stayed on me a little longer than they should have, and that strange knot tightened in my stomach, a mix of awkwardness and something else I couldn't quite name. I turned on my heel, ready to leave, but something held me back. Was it curiosity? The way he looked at me, as though he wasn't sure whether to be embarrassed or amused, stirred something inside me, something I wasn't prepared to deal with. I needed to get out of there, clear my head, pretend this never happened. But even as I walked away, I could feel his gaze lingering on me. And worse, I wanted to look back. I didn't, but that tension stuck with me long after I'd left the room. Over the next few hours, I tried to go about my day like nothing happened, but my mind kept replaying that scene in the library. The way he'd looked at me, the way he quickly hid the book, like it was some forbidden secret. It shouldn't have mattered, it was just a book, right? But the tension in that moment felt heavier than it should have. By evening, I was restless. My mind was a mess of thoughts I didn't want to have, questions I didn't want answers to. Why did I care what he was reading? Why did it bother me so much? I tried to shake it off, convincing myself it was nothing. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. Something had shifted, and whether I liked it or not, I couldn't ignore it. The next morning, I avoided him completely, at least, I tried to. But of course, fate had other plans. As I walked into the kitchen, there he was, standing by the counter, making coffee like nothing had happened. My heart did that annoying little flutter thing again, and I hated it. "Morning," he said, his voice casual, but his eyes, they held something different. Or maybe I was imagining it. I muttered a quick morning and grabbed a glass of water, keeping my eyes on anything but him. But then he said something that caught me off guard. "About yesterday," he began, and my stomach twisted into knots. I didn't want to talk about it, didn't want to acknowledge the tension. But there was no escaping it now. "Forget it," I said quickly, cutting him off. "It's not a big deal." I tried to sound nonchalant, but my voice betrayed me, wavering just slightly. He smiled, just a hint of amusement, like he could tell I was lying. "If you say so," he replied, and there was something in his tone that sent a shiver down my spine. Was it teasing? Or was it something more? I couldn't tell, and that only made things worse. The rest of the day passed in a blur, but the tension remained, hanging in the air like a storm waiting to break. And deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. What happened next? Well, let's just say, things got a whole lot more complicated. The next few days felt different. The air between us was charged with something unspoken. Joel went about his usual routine as if nothing had happened, but I couldn't get the image of him sitting in that chair, reading that book, out of my head. It was like a scene burned into my mind, replaying at the most inconvenient moments. I told myself it was nothing, just an awkward situation I walked into. But it didn't feel like nothing. Every time we ended up in the same room, I became hyper-aware of everything: his presence, the way he moved, the subtle shifts in his expression. And every time, my heart would race, my breath catching in my throat. It was ridiculous, really. I was overthinking it, right? I had to be. But then, why couldn't I shake the tension that seemed to hang in the air whenever we were near each other? One evening, it was just the two of us in the living room. The TV was on, playing some random show neither of us cared about. The silence between us stretched, thick with something I couldn't name. I tried to focus on the screen, but I could feel him sitting just a few feet away, and it was impossible to ignore. "Want some tea?" Joel's voice broke the silence, startling me slightly. I turned to look at him, forcing myself to act normal. "Sure," I said, but my voice came out more breathless than I intended. He got up, disappearing into the kitchen, and I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. It was just tea. Nothing more. But my heart didn't seem to get the memo, it was still racing. When he came back, he handed me a cup, and for a moment, our fingers touched. The contact was brief, barely more than a brush of skin, but it sent a jolt through me. My eyes flicked up to meet his, and for a split second, I saw something in his gaze. Something I couldn't quite place. Was it curiosity? Hesitation? Or something else entirely? "Thanks," I murmured, quickly pulling my hand back and taking a sip of the tea, though I barely tasted it. Joel sat back down, and we fell into silence again, but it wasn't the same. The tension in the room felt almost tangible now, like a third presence neither of us could ignore. I went to bed that night feeling restless, my mind spinning with thoughts I didn't want to have. I kept telling myself it was nothing, that I was reading too much into things. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't forget the way his gaze lingered on me just a moment too long, or the way that brief touch had set my pulse racing. It was stupid. It didn't mean anything. It couldn't mean anything. But the tension only grew. The next day, I tried to avoid him altogether, hoping that space would help clear my head. It didn't. If anything, it made things worse. Every time I caught a glimpse of him, my thoughts would spiral, and I hated that I couldn't control it. It wasn't like I wanted to feel this way. It wasn't like I wanted to think about him the way I was. But the more I tried not to, the more it consumed me. That evening, I found myself alone with him again. This time, it was in the kitchen. I was making myself a snack when he walked in, the soft sound of his footsteps making me tense. I didn't turn around, hoping he'd just grab whatever he needed and leave. But he didn't. Instead, he stopped a few feet behind me. "Long day?" he asked casually, but there was something in his tone, something that made my heart skip a beat. "Yeah," I replied, keeping my back to him as I finished what I was doing. I could feel his eyes on me, and it was making it hard to think straight. There was a brief pause before he said, "About the other night." I froze, my hands gripping the edge of the counter a little too tightly. I didn't want to have this conversation. I didn't want to acknowledge whatever was happening between us. "It's fine," I said quickly, trying to sound nonchalant. "It wasn't a big deal." "It felt like it was," he said quietly, and that made me turn around. His expression was serious, but there was something else in his eyes, something I couldn't quite read. "I didn't mean to make things awkward." "You didn't," I lied, though my voice betrayed me, shaking just slightly. I tried to hold his gaze, but it was too much. Too intense. I looked away, pretending to be focused on my snack. But Joel didn't move. He stayed right where he was, the silence between us growing heavier by the second. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, each beat echoing in my ears. This wasn't normal. None of this was normal. And yet, I couldn't seem to walk away. The following day, I told myself I needed to snap out of it. I needed to stop thinking about him, stop overanalyzing every little moment. But it was easier said than done. Especially when he was always there, just a room away, just close enough to keep the tension simmering beneath the surface. By the time the weekend rolled around, I was at my wit's end. I didn't know how to act around him anymore. Every interaction felt loaded, every glance charged with something I didn't want to acknowledge. And the worst part was, he seemed just as affected. He wasn't avoiding me, but he wasn't exactly acting normal either. It was like we were both trying too hard to pretend nothing had changed, and in doing so, we only made it more obvious that everything had. That evening, we ended up in the living room again, just the two of us. I didn't know why I stayed. I could have gone to my room, but something kept me there, sitting across from him in tense silence. The TV was on, but neither of us was watching it. "Are you okay?" Joel asked suddenly, his voice breaking the silence. I glanced at him, caught off guard by the question. "Yeah." "Why?" "You just seem different," he said, his gaze steady, like he was trying to read me. I opened my mouth to deny it, to brush it off like I always did, but the words wouldn't come. Because he was right. I was different. Everything was different. And pretending otherwise wasn't working anymore. "I guess I've just been tired," I said finally, though it wasn't the whole truth. Joel nodded, but he didn't look convinced. And as the silence settled around us once more, I realized that this tension, this thing between us, wasn't going away. If anything, it was only getting stronger. And deep down, I knew it was only a matter of time before something gave. By now, it was clear we both knew something was happening between us, though neither of us dared to say it aloud. Instead, we danced around the tension, pretending it didn't exist, finding excuses to be in the same room longer than necessary. Conversations that had once been light and effortless now carried a weight, a magnetic pull neither of us could ignore. It wasn't intentional, at least not at first. But soon, every shared moment felt more charged, every glance a silent question. Were we imagining it? Or was something real brewing beneath the surface? One night, we found ourselves alone again, sitting side by side on the couch. The movie played on the screen, but I barely registered it. All I could focus on was the space, or rather, the lack of it, between us. Joel shifted slightly, and before I knew it, he was closer, close enough that our arms brushed. It was such a small thing, something that should have meant nothing. But it didn't. It meant everything. I tried to keep my breathing steady, my focus on the screen, but my mind refused to cooperate. Every nerve in my body was acutely aware of him, his warmth, his scent, the way his presence made my heart race in ways it shouldn't. When the movie ended, I expected him to get up, to put some distance between us like he always did. But he didn't. Instead, he turned toward me, his gaze lingering a little too long. "Are you okay?" he asked softly, his voice low, almost hesitant. I nodded quickly, maybe too quickly, trying to mask the turmoil brewing inside me. "Yeah. I'm fine." But I wasn't fine. Not even close. My pulse was racing, my palms felt clammy, and I hated how obvious it probably was. "You seem different," he added, his eyes never leaving mine. I wanted to look away, to break the intensity of the moment, but I couldn't. Something about the way he was looking at me held me captive, as if daring me to admit what we both knew but refused to say. "I guess I've just been tired," I mumbled, repeating the same excuse I'd used before. But even as the words left my mouth, I knew they sounded hollow, unconvincing. And judging by the way Joel's expression shifted, he wasn't buying it either. The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. I should have stood up, ended the moment before it spiraled into something neither of us could control. But I didn't. I stayed frozen in place, caught between what I knew was right and what I couldn't seem to resist. The next day, I woke up feeling drained, like I hadn't slept at all. My mind kept replaying the night before, the way Joel's gaze had lingered on me, the way I'd felt when our arms brushed. It was maddening, this constant push and pull between desire and logic. I tried to avoid him again, thinking that distance would help clear my head. But it didn't. If anything, it made things worse. Every time I heard his voice from another room, every time I caught a glimpse of him passing by, that same tension gripped me, refusing to let go. That evening, I was in the kitchen when Joel walked in. My back was to him, but I knew it was him the moment I heard his footsteps. My body tensed instinctively, and I cursed myself for reacting this way. "Need any help?" he asked, his tone casual, though there was an undercurrent of something I couldn't quite place. "No, I'm good," I replied quickly, keeping my eyes on the task in front of me. I hoped he'd take the hint and leave, but he didn't. Instead, he stayed, leaning against the counter a few feet away. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the faint hum of the fridge and the soft clinking of dishes as I worked. But the silence wasn't comfortable, it was charged, heavy with all the things we weren't saying. "I've been thinking," Joel said finally, breaking the silence. My hands froze mid-motion, my heart leaping into my throat. "About what?" I asked, keeping my voice as steady as I could manage. He hesitated, as if weighing his words carefully. "About us." My breath hitched. Us. That single word felt like a spark in a room already filled with gasoline. I turned to face him, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. "There is no us," I said quickly, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. There was something neither of us could deny, no matter how hard we tried. Joel didn't move, didn't look away. "Are you sure about that?" he asked softly, his voice laced with something I couldn't quite identify, hope, fear, maybe both. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. Because the truth was, I wasn't sure. I wasn't sure about anything anymore. All I knew was that every time we were near each other, the air felt heavier, the world felt smaller, and I couldn't seem to think straight. "I don't know," I admitted finally, my voice barely more than a whisper. "I don't know what this is, Joel. But it's confusing." He took a step closer, and I felt my pulse quicken, my breath hitching in my throat. "It's confusing for me too," he said quietly. "But that doesn't mean it's not real." His words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. I wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, that we couldn't do this. But I couldn't. Because deep down, I knew he was right. Whatever this was, it was real. And it terrified me. That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling as a whirlwind of emotions swirled inside me. I didn't know what to do, didn't know how to make sense of what I was feeling. All I knew was that something had shifted, and there was no going back now. We had crossed a line, whether we wanted to admit it or not. And the scariest part? A part of me didn't want to go back. A part of me wanted to see where this would lead, no matter how dangerous it might be. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon when everything changed. I was in the kitchen, slicing vegetables for lunch, when I heard footsteps behind me. I didn't have to turn around to know who it was, my pulse quickened instantly. Jules stepped into the room, and though I tried to focus on the task at hand, I couldn't ignore the way the air seemed to thicken with his presence. "Need any help?" he asked, his voice casual, but there was something beneath it, something that made my fingers hesitate for just a moment before I resumed chopping. "No, I've got it," I replied, keeping my back to him, hoping he'd take the hint and leave. But he didn't. Instead, he stayed, leaning against the counter a little too close for comfort. I could feel the weight of his gaze on me, and it made my heart race in a way that I didn't want to admit. The silence between us stretched, growing heavier by the second. I knew I should say something, anything, to break the tension, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I turned to face him, my breath catching in my throat when I realized just how close he was standing. "What's going on?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. I hated how shaky it sounded, how it gave away the storm of emotions brewing inside me. Joel hesitated, his eyes searching mine as though he was trying to find the right words. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice quiet but steady. "But I can't stop thinking about you." His confession hung in the air, heavy and dangerous. My mind screamed at me to walk away, to end this before it went any further. But my body refused to move. Every instinct I had was pulling me toward him, even though I knew it was wrong. "You shouldn't say things like that," I whispered, though my voice lacked conviction. I wasn't telling him to stop, I was telling myself. Joel didn't move, didn't look away. "Maybe I shouldn't," he said, his tone soft but unwavering. "But it's the truth." I felt my breath hitch, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. This wasn't supposed to happen. He was my stepfather, and yet here we were, standing inches apart, the line we'd been so careful not to cross now just a distant memory. I don't know what this is," I admitted, my voice trembling with a mix of fear and something else, something I didn't want to name. "I don't either," Joel said quietly. "But it feels real." That was it, the moment I knew there was no going back. The tension that had been building between us for days, maybe weeks, had finally reached its breaking point. And instead of running, instead of ending it before it could go too far, I took a step closer. It was subtle, just a small shift in distance, but it was enough. Joel noticed, his eyes flicking down to my lips before meeting my gaze again. The unspoken desire between us was undeniable now, and I knew that if I didn't stop this, it would change everything. But I didn't want to stop. Without thinking, without allowing myself time to second guess, I reached up, my fingers brushing lightly against his arm. Joel's breath hitched at the contact, and for a moment, we just stood there, caught in the gravity of something neither of us could control. "I can't," I started to say, but the words faded as Joel leaned in, closing the last bit of distance between us. His hand came up, gently cupping my face, and before I knew it, his lips were on mine. It was soft at first, tentative, as though he was giving me one last chance to pull away. But I didn't. I leaned into him, my heart racing as the kiss deepened, as the line we had so carefully avoided shattered completely. The world around us faded, there was no kitchen, no lunch, no rules or boundaries. There was only us, caught in a moment we couldn't undo. When we finally pulled apart, both of us were breathless, our gazes locked in a mix of shock and something else, something that felt a lot like relief. "I shouldn't have," Joel started, but I shook my head, cutting him off. "Don't," I said quietly. "Just don't." We stood there for what felt like an eternity, neither of us knowing what to say, neither of us ready to face what had just happened. But one thing was clear, there was no going back now. The rest of the day passed in a blur. We didn't talk about what happened, didn't acknowledge the kiss, but the tension between us had shifted. It wasn't just unspoken desire anymore, it was something real, something dangerous. And it scared me. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the moment over and over in my mind. I didn't know what this meant, didn't know what would happen next. But one thing was certain, we had crossed a line, and there was no pretending it didn't happen. I should have felt guilty. I should have regretted it. But I didn't. And that scared me more than anything else. Because a part of me wanted more. A part of me wanted to see where this would lead, even though I knew it was a path filled with danger. As I drifted off to sleep, one thought lingered in my mind, the line was crossed, and nothing would ever be the same again. We didn't talk about what happened that day, but everything between us shifted. It was impossible to pretend that nothing had changed. We had crossed a line, and every look, every accidental touch, carried a new weight. The air between us felt heavier, charged with something we both understood but didn't dare to name. I found myself craving his presence, even when I knew it was wrong. And the worst part? He seemed to feel the same. One evening, the silence finally broke. "We need to talk," Joel said quietly, his voice steady but low. My heart skipped a beat, a knot forming in my stomach. I knew this was inevitable, but that didn't make it any easier. "I can't stop thinking about you," he admitted, his eyes locked on mine. His voice carried a mix of longing and regret, and I could feel the tension thickening around us. I didn't know what to say. What could I say? Instead, I reached for his hand, holding it tightly, as if that simple gesture could convey all the words I couldn't find. In that moment, it became clear, whatever this was, it wasn't something we could just walk away from. It was messy, complicated, and forbidden. But it was also real, undeniable, and we were in it together. That night, things went further than they ever had before. We were alone in the living room, sitting closer than we probably should have been. The air was thick with tension, each of us waiting for the other to make the first move. I don't know who leaned in first, it didn't matter. All I knew was that one moment, we were sitting there in silence, and the next, his lips were on mine. It started softly, hesitantly, as if testing the waters. But that didn't last long. Before I knew it, the kiss deepened, becoming something more, something urgent. His hand slipped around my waist, pulling me closer, and I didn't resist. I couldn't. Every logical thought vanished, replaced by a need I didn't fully understand but couldn't deny. I felt his fingers brush the side of my neck, his touch sending shivers down my spine. My hands moved on their own, finding his shoulders, holding him closer. I could feel the warmth of his skin beneath my fingertips, and it made my head spin. At some point, we broke apart just long enough to catch our breath, but even then, the tension didn't ease. His eyes met mine, dark and filled with something that sent a thrill through me. Neither of us said a word, there was nothing to say. Instead, he leaned in again, his lips trailing down my neck, slow and deliberate. I felt a rush of heat, my breath hitching as his hands slid down my sides, lingering just enough to make my heart race. It was maddening, the way he touched me, the way he seemed to know exactly what he was doing without even trying. I wasn't thinking anymore, I couldn't think. All I knew was that I didn't want him to stop. And then, he whispered my name, softly, like a question, as if he was giving me one last chance to stop this. But I didn't want to stop. I didn't care about anything else in that moment. All I cared about was him, and the way he made me feel like I was the only person in the world. Afterward, we sat in silence, the weight of what had just happened settling over us. I should have felt guilty. I should have regretted it. But I didn't. All I felt was a strange kind of relief, like something that had been building for weeks had finally been released. Joel reached for my hand, intertwining our fingers. "Are you okay?" he asked softly, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, though I wasn't entirely sure what okay even meant anymore. "Yeah. I think so." We didn't talk about what this meant, didn't try to define whatever we had just crossed into. It felt too fragile, too new, like speaking it aloud would break the spell. Instead, we just sat there, hands still joined, as the night stretched on around us. The days that followed felt surreal. We didn't talk about it, but the tension was gone, replaced by something different, something unspoken but understood. I noticed the way Joel would glance at me when he thought I wasn't looking, the way his hand would brush mine in passing, lingering just a second too long. It was dangerous, and we both knew it. But neither of us could stop. One evening, as we stood in the kitchen, I caught him watching me again. This time, I didn't look away. Instead, I closed the distance between us, standing so close I could feel his breath on my skin. "This is insane," I whispered, though there was no conviction behind my words. "I know," he replied, his voice low, almost a growl. "But I don't care." Neither did I. We knew it couldn't last, not like this. Eventually, something would give. But for now, we were caught in this whirlwind, and neither of us wanted it to stop. And maybe, just maybe, we didn't care about the consequences anymore. And that's where it ends, for now. But you know what? I bet some of you have a lot to say about this in the comments. So go ahead, tell me what you think. Would you have done things differently? Or are some lines just meant to be crossed? Anyway, that's it. Or is it?
Bye.